Hello. This is the second time I record myself giving this lecture. I was really upset when it didn't record because I think that colonialism is such an interesting topic that's universal and that we know because we live it, and it's part of a lot of countries around the world and their history, and it's a part of life. It's such a key subject that, of course, if we were to talk about globalization and world Englishes, we need to talk about colonialism, which is probably one of the ways that English was spread, not probably, which is one of the ways in which English got spread initially and reached other parts of the world. So we need to problematize colonialism, and we need to stop romanticizing what a lot of people have romanticized today, especially if you think about, for instance, Puerto Rico with Spain, how they have this Spanish ideology as la madre patria, the heritage home, right? And the same notion happens with the US and Britain. So it's a lot of kind of maybe cultural and historical amnesia that people don't look at the facts and people don't look at the social atrocities, and they take everything that's right now part of our modern society as a fact, right? And this includes the global status of English, that we accept it as a fact, but we don't problematize the socio and historical circumstances that led to English's spread. So world Englishes cannot be abstracted from the socio-historical events that led to them. People like to think about English as a linguistic fact of life. Things were always that way. But this idea needs to be questioned and cannot be accepted. Colonialism was neither a natural or neutral process. It's not a biological process. It was man-made interference. And it involved the large-scale coercion and displacement of indigenous groups. This violent process impacted the whole world in major ways, the lives of those whose lands were colonized. The effects of colonialism are still felt in these communities and in countries around the world to this day. Results of colonization through imposition of English. So there are many results of colonization through the imposition of English, but Jenkins decides to focus on the following in this particular section of her book. She says, number one, the imposition of English in colonialization led to the endangerment of many indigenous languages. Endangerment meaning that fewer speakers were allowed to speak it, and they were subject to a lot of newer linguistic norms that tried to displace their heritage, culture, and language. And second, a consequence was the denigrating of colonized people, ultimately leading to their loss of identity because they're being discriminated against and treated horribly on the basis of where they're from and their culture and their language and how it's different from the colonizers. So having this sort of attitude, this violent aggression towards them, led in many cases and in many contexts to language loss in those communities. So a major legacy of the two diasporas that we've discussed in World Englishes so far is the assumption of inferiority of the indigenous people. So that's a major legacy of colonialism, that they thought that anything that had to do with indigenous language, culture, and even indigenous people's characters were appalling, were abhorrent, were horrendous, were hedonistic, sinful practices, and even their spiritual beliefs and everything about them. So here I'll start reading some excerpts that are in our Global Englishes book. So a knowledge of the English tongue and its authors, therefore, appears to hold a place of the first importance in a plan for the intellectual and moral elevation of the Hindus. So part of the plan is for them to help them gain or accomplish a higher sense of morality. And them in this case is the Hindus, which is an indigenous population. So it's through the knowledge of the English tongue. The English language will not only prove a more correct medium of giving public instruction to the students, but it will facilitate their progress in useful knowledge, right? Because anything that has to do with their indigenous culture is not useful knowledge, right? But that you need English to be able to acquire that intellect, that level of intellect or that level of high culture, right? All the Indian languages have been so many ages the vehicle of everything in their superstition, which is morally debasing or corrupting to the mind. And so much is the grossly impure structure of heathenism wrought into the native languages. So here we're getting a lot of attacks on indigenous people's moralities on the basis of their language. Hedonism, meaning that they engage in sinful practices that are not your typical Christian values, that the bare study of them often proves injurious to the mind of the European. So the indigenous language is not worthy of study in the eyes of the European, but also, for those of you who don't know what injurious is, injurious comes from the word injury. So injurious meaning that it's likely to cause harm or damage to the Europeans if they ever studied their language. So it's not worthy of studying at all. It's worthy of abandoning. So a major legacy of the two diasporas studied is the assumption of the inferiority. Let's continue and let's see how that plays out in this newer excerpt. Fearful indeed is the impress of degradation, which is stamped on the language of the savage. More fearful, perhaps even, that which is stamped upon his form. When wholly letting go the truth, when long and greatly sinning against light and conscious, a people has thus gone downward way, has been scattered off by some violent catastrophe from those regions of the world which are the seats of advance and progress. So us, we're very distant from them. We're the holders of advancement and progress. You want to be like us. They're so far away in terms of us and our position in the world. And driven to its remote isles and further corners, then as one nobler thought, one spiritual idea after another has perished from it, the words also that express these have perished too. As one habit of civilization has been let go after another, the words which those habits demanded have dropped as well, first out of use and then out of memory, and thus after a while have been wholly lost. So basically, if anyone were to acquire this language, they would also acquire not elevated or elegant or conscious or moral ways of thinking, but they would acquire something that is against morality. It's degradation. Probably everybody would agree that an Englishman would be right in considering his way of looking at the world and at life better than that of the Maori or the Hottentot, and no one will object in the abstract to England doing her best to impose her better and higher views on those savages. Okay, again, the Englishman is uplifted as the emblem of what is right that the indigenous communities cannot measure up against. So the indigenous communities are seen as savages, as incorrect. Okay, and look at look at the wording, the discourse. So better, the way of the English is better. Their language is better. Higher than those savages, okay? So all of these ideologies of language were there in colonial times when two cultures come into contact with one another. To understand the momentous nature of the first English voyage to America, We have to appreciate the forlorn position of these weary travelers in strange landscapes without a single reference point. Oh my, they must be so lost. We have to imagine a world in which all languages were foreign. Oh man. All communications are difficult and even hazardous. Ways of communicating are dangerous. Just as the Saxon English confronted the Norse languages, adapted their speech so the settlers of the Roanoke, Jamestown, and Plymouth, confronted by the needs to communicate with Indians who could not speak a word of English, also adapted theirs. So notice, let's break it down. Notice the word choice in some of these excerpts. So some of the words that are used to describe the colonizers and their situations. So what they're living is momentous in nature. It's kind of like a monster. It's dangerous. So they're the heroes of the story. They're the brave heroes. And they're in a forlorn position. What does forlorn mean? Forlorn is an adjective. It means pitiful, sad, abandoned, or lonely. Oh, poor lonely colonizers. It's not like they're powerful and killing off everybody and stealing their goods or anything, stealing their lands. Weary travelers, oh, after a long journey across seas, we're so tired. Confronted by the need to communicate, they're up against something, okay? So they're the underdogs, adapted to their speech. They're the ones that are undergoing the dominion of the indigenous people. They are the ones that have to adapt. To see, look at the incongruencies of the actual historical facts that are far away from however they're painting themselves as. And then you see the reference to indigenous populations and their situation. Strange landscape. Indigenous people are strange and their landscape is strange. All languages foreign, alien languages. Communications are difficult. Difficult. All of these words are social constructs. They're values, okay? They're ideologies. They don't have any scientific fact. And even hazardous. Hazardous means dangerous. Indians who cannot speak a word of English, oh my, so they must be dangerous. So there's a lot of historical romanticizing of colonial ancestors as the motherland. And we see this example in contemporary United States and how a lot of Americans uphold the British as intellectual or how their accent is desirable, right? But then we also see the same situation with us in Puerto Rico and how a lot of us talk about peninsular Spain as being the motherland, la madre patria. We even have it in our national anthem, which I've always wondered why. It's not even like part of our modern history. It happened so many years ago, and it was a violent process, colonization. A lot of people died. So why the hell are we romanticizing Christopher Columbus? It's madness. So, for instance, there was a monument that some of you may know of that was accepted in Arecibo. It's a massive monument. I think it's as big as El Cristo of Brazil. Yeah, so a lot of US cities turned down this monument, and a lot of countries said, we don't want this. We don't want an image of colonialism. We don't want to romanticize it. We don't want anyone to think that it was a nice time. But then who welcomes it with open arms? Puerto Rico, right? Look at the incongruencies. But then we fight for independence, and then we're super nationalistic, and we try to paint ourselves as different from the United States, but we're still holding on to another colonial past. So it doesn't make any sense. But here we have our most recent aggressive history, or our most recent history of violence that Puerto Rico underwent. And those were the events of 1898 in the Spanish-American War. So following the Spanish-American War and the Treaty of Paris, where Puerto Rico was ceded to the United States, so there was an explicit agenda of Americanizing Puerto Ricans, and English was seen as key towards this dream of incorporating this newly acquired land and peoples in order for them to accomplish ultimate imperial power, right? The ultimate American dream. So this goes well, even though this is part of modern history, this goes well also with what we know of colonialism, which was characterized by the disparagement of the non-Anglo, especially the non-white, even when writers appear to be attempting to produce an unbiased record of events. So even when they're trying to describe the situation that they're finding themselves in, the foreign situation of their realities, right? There are still biases and still ideologies and still stereotypes being written about and documented by these colonizers. So they say, for instance, let us educate them, these people. So kind of distancing themselves, us versus them. Teach them what government of the people means, meaning that, you know, before them, they didn't know how to survive, how to run themselves. They don't know how to organize themselves. They do not know and never will unless the people of the United States teach them. So here's Americans or the United States projecting themselves as the saviors, the heroes, right? It is inhuman, all right, doing the heroic act and an act of bad faith, sorry, to assist the dominant 5%, to keep them in subjection and ignorance. So it's inhuman. We're keeping them in ignorance. We must do what is right. It is our job to educate them. But what exactly do you mean when you say educate people? So it might be supposed that the educated governing class would desire to educate the mass of the people, so the educated people in Puerto Rico at the time, but it is not so. They don't want to educate other people on the island. In talking with an educated Puerto Rican, an MD, who was graduated from one of our medical colleges, I suggested a perfect system of free schools. He assured me that that would never do. It would do to have higher education for the centers of wealth, of course, but education of the masses would destroy labor. So this guy sounds super elitist. He wants to control education for the dominant few. Anyway, so going back to the main person who wrote this letter to the New York Times, an Army officer, Harvey. This MD expressed surprise that I, an Army officer, should favor universal education and believe in a Republican form of government. So he believes in a conservative form of government. Turn this island over to the dominant class and it'll be Spanish in all but 100 years from now. So again, it's this kind of dream that in order to fully be in harmony with the United States, you need to do away with Spanish. You need to abandon your Spanish roots and culture and overnight, unquestionably so, accept this new incoming invasion. Make a district of Puerto Rico. Appoint a commission of citizens of the United States to govern it. Introduce a few hundred school teachers. So introduce from the outside, because from the inside, they're no good. Introduce from the outside teachers and make schools, right? To standardize and to promote their way of living. Organize a system of free schools teaching nothing but English. So again, this whole dream that the acquirement of English needs to come at the expense of Spanish and Spanish culture. And in a few years, a portion of these people can be safely admitted into the government. So they're a danger right now. Yeah, we don't want them. They're hazardous, they're savages. But if we educate them into our way of thinking and being, if we give them the English language, which is the language of the civilized and the language of the intelligent, then yeah, they can join us. So that is the kind of linguistic ideology that is present in times of colonialism and still present today. there are still a lot of negative ideologies tied to Spanish speakers and Latinos in mainland United States today. So this article is cited again in a book published by Nelson Dennis called War Against All Puerto Ricans. War Against All Puerto Ricans talks about all things colonialism in Puerto Rico, even into modern history. So on February 22nd, 1899, the New York Times ran an article headlined Americanizing Puerto Rico, describing Puerto Ricans as uneducated, simple-minded, and harmless people who are only interested in wine, women, music, and dancing. So this is kind of all part of what we saw in the previous letter by that Army officer, S.S. Harvey. So a lot of the people had these preconceptions of the Puerto Rican population as not possessing or incapable of possessing abstract or intellectual thought, and but needing to be taught by others. So the discourse of colonialism, given the attitudes towards the native languages of indigenous populations in the colonized lands, it is not surprising that when colonized peoples made the effort to communicate in English, their English was denigrated as broken and the like. So it's not surprising that if historically they faced all of these setbacks, that they would still be looked down upon whenever they even try to accomplish the dominant language. And we still see the case a lot in the United States, in the UK, and in English only settings, but also we probably see this a lot again in other parts of the world that we maybe don't even know about. So linguistic discrimination happens everywhere. And that whole linguistic discrimination tied to colonialism idea is further expanded in the book that I've included in the slide, English with an Accent by Rosina Lippi Green. It's a really good resource for language ideologies. And it even goes on to mention some contemporary examples of linguistic discrimination and language ideologies of, for instance, the accents that are used for Disney characters, for animals versus princesses and all that stuff. So this attitude of broken English, or the non-whites as speaking broken English, is still in this world today. Discourses, here's some other examples of discourses against non-native speakers of English. So here our example is drawn from the UK. So in the UK, a lot of people feel very negative about the figure Yoko Ono. And she's often credited as the person that broke up the Beatles. There were some articles that were run in the Evening Standard and The Guardian in late 1990s, early 2000s that discriminated and described Yoko Ono's speech as something that was undesirable. And they went as far as to use really mean adjectives. Like, for instance, they said, the Guardian said, her mouthing of the English language. And Evening Standard said, and having the voice to be used against a peculiarly spirited inmate in Khmer Rouge death camp. Wow. So like even in an inmate in a death camp, that's a pretty low bar. So only recently some former colonies and people who possess English non-natively and so on have begun to describe and codify and standardize their Englishes, even second language English speakers, as we've seen in previous sections. But this whole movement of new Englishes is only at its beginning stages. This whole describing, codification, and standardization move. And even if it does have linguistic approval, even if it does have a lot of grants and people working on it, they will still face social, they will still face a social obstacle. And the social obstacle is that people will still look at UK Standard English and US English as the most desirable, the most correct, right? And anything else that's not that is inferior, less than, or even incorrect. But all of these different words that are used to talk about standard Englishes from the UK and US are unscientific. They're all language ideologies based on current social inequalities, based on notions of who is in power, who is prestigious, and who is not. Because every language ideology, deep down, is not an ideology of language itself, but it's an ideology of the people who speak that language. And that's something important that I want you to keep in mind. So they will still face ideological setbacks. Okay, so this whole movement of new Englishes. So good English is still seen as synonymous to that of the educated native speakers born in the United States and the United Kingdom. Good English, however, if you ask any linguist or anyone that observes language from a descriptive level, from an objective level, language as an artifact, good is a sentiment. It's a social construct. What is good? What is bad, right? It depends on the context, on the culture. It's based on socio-historical inequalities for our part of the world, especially when we talk about language. So which languages get standardized and codified versus which do not? What is good and bad are assessments and beliefs. Beliefs may change according to context and the times that we're living in, okay? So beliefs are not static entities. They are not facts, but they were brought up in the first place through different socio-historical events like colonization. So there are many repercussions to having negative ideologies against the non-native speaker. For some of the ones that are mentioned in this book are the following. So it may affect a second language speaker's attitudes towards themselves, towards their intellect, and towards their use of English. So it may result in a lack of confidence. Maybe your second language learner will decide not to refrain from speaking or engaging in English for fear of being made fun of or discriminated against. And that's definitely the case for a lot of Puerto Ricans who quote unquote say they're not bilingual or they don't know English because maybe at some point they were shamed. It happens to many second language speakers. It happens to everybody. Especially it happens to English teachers. Here's a quote from an English teacher provided in the book, a fluent bilingual speaker and teacher of English from Hungary. So she says, "We non-native teachers of English suffer from an inferiority complex caused by a glaring defect in our knowledge of English. We are in constant distress as we realize how little we know about the language we are supposed to teach." So there are two parts to this quote. The first part is that, yes, indeed, there is a psychological inferiority complex in a lot of second language speakers, especially English teachers, because English teachers are upheld by society as the language models, as the sustainers of the standard, as the ones that instruct everyone else on the standard. So they're in a high stakes situation. They're under a lot of pressure. So if they cannot perform up to the standard, they may lack confidence or they may feel negative about themselves. And the fact of the matter is that she's a fluent bilingual. So by the description of Jenkins, so this probably means that she can get by with English and standard English just fine. But that no matter the competency or the fluency that she has acquired throughout her career, no matter the degrees in English and all the different certificates in English, and experience, and if she publishes books and she writes, whatever, no matter, she will always be a second language learner of English. And she will always have another first language. And this is something that happens to many people. Again, it's not just English teachers. It happens to a lot of second language learners. So maybe you can reflect on your own experiences. Maybe you feel very competent in English, but then maybe you say that if you're talking to a native speaker, that's when you start freaking out and feeling nervous, right? But the thing that I want you to consider, and this is not part of the class, but this is a part of linguistics, is that the monolingual and the bilingual are quite different. And not just in terms of, yes, one of them speaks more languages, but the fact of the matter is that speaking more languages does something to your brain. So the bilingual brain and the monolingual brain are not carbon copies. They're not the same. Yes, they do have, your dominant executive functions and, all that neurological stuff. But the bilingual brain has two language systems encoded, okay? Two language systems with sets of rules of syntax, of grammar, of phonology, of appropriateness of speech, etc., of so many things. So they have two language systems housed alongside each other. And these systems aren't necessarily kept always separate. It's not that the bilingual brain is two monolingual languages in one mind. That's not how it works. The bilingual brain is an integrated system, okay? So bilinguals have multiplicity of symbols in their brain. They can take from different language systems accordingly. So it's very natural if your first language influences your second language. It's a very natural phenomenon. And if your second language, English in this case maybe, influences your first, it's also very natural. It's the outcome of having multiplicity of symbols and codes and ways of communicating in your brain, and that is okay. That doesn't mean that you speak an inferior way of communicating. That doesn't mean that you're incapable of communicating and expressing yourself. And that doesn't mean that you can't accomplish the prestigious standard, because you can, right? And you can also accomplish other registers, other dialects. It's all about practice, okay? But the bilingual brain is different. The monolingual brain only has one language system, okay? So who are we to judge a bilingual using the same using the benchmark of the monolingual speaker who only has one language? It's not fair. Also, it's not the reality of the world. The reality of the world is, for a lot of countries, multilingualism and bilingualism is the norm, okay? So, but the fact of the matter is that in a lot of English-speaking contexts, like the United States, like the UK, etc., English has become so globalized that with it comes a lot of also dynamics of who owns English. Is it the people, the ancestral people, the heritage people? What about these newer Englishes happening? So again, it is not fair, and it's not scientifically accurate to compare two people with different sets of minds. It's disparate. If you were to compare a bilingual, you would probably have to compare to other bilinguals in terms of their competence and their production, okay? But never to a monolingual. And also, just because someone's a monolingual, well, that means they're limited to their language system. But there's evidence that shows that bilingualism is a benefit, is an advantage. It helps people not only just culturally and and be more culturally sensitive and opens up more doors. But also it's been shown that it helps people solve mathematical equations. It has also been shown that it helps prevent um, this, it helps prevent memory loss, which is, forget the name, Alzheimer's. So there's a lot of cool evidence for bilingualism. And when you put the pros and the cons and they stack up, bilingualism has more pros and monolingualism is definitely limiting, especially now in a more mobile world where people are traveling all over the place and for trade and business and career purposes. So bilingualism is something that you should aspire to in multilingualism, okay? But there are negative ideologies in English speaking contexts like the United States and the UK that say that English only is the way and that multilingualism is bad, you know? So these monolingual ideologies that are false and based on subjective opinions that have no scientific basis, they have repercussions on how people view themselves and how people live their lives, okay? And then also I'd like to add an anecdote, and I know I'm kind of like blabbing on, but I'll go really fast. So in 2010, which was 10 years ago, I taught English in Europe, in the Czech Republic, at an English camp. I was in my third year of my undergraduate degree in English linguistics. I had already taught English to a Burmese refugee family at the University of Arizona. So I was living at the University of Arizona before I went to the Czech Republic. But I did my degree in Puerto Rico. And I did a year abroad at the University of Arizona, an entire year. And I did my year abroad. I taught English to a Burmese refugee family. I had straight A's in all of my English classes. I excelled. I worked at a writing center. I wrote stories. I felt an intimate connection with the English language. And dare I say, I'm really ashamed of this. At that time, my connection was more with English than it was with Spanish. So I used English on a daily basis for everything, to even write down my own thoughts and rationalize things. English is and was back then my dominant language. All of my previous schooling had been in English, although in Puerto Rico, but in English. And I read books and I wrote stories and whatever. So I felt like I had ownership to English and that nobody could question my competence and proficiency. And I remember I was in a foreign situation and teaching, right? So I corrected a student's paper, and there were American teachers as well. I was the only Latina. The other American teachers were white, Caucasian, from Arizona. So I graded a girl's assignment, and I'm a grammar Nazi. So I tried to help her out as best I could, and I explained to her why, what she was using was bad. And then when I returned the assignment to her and she saw it, she was so angry. You could see it in her face. She could not take constructive criticism at all, which is the whole point of an English class. And she wasn't even getting graded for the essay. She was just being advised. So she was so angry. And she said to me, she came up to me with the essay at hand and she said, "What do you know anyway? English is not even your first language." And I feel like, how there's always one of those times in your life that shapes who you are. There are moments in life that make you who you are. That was definitely one of those moments in my life that made me question my identity. So it made me question whether English was my dominant language. It made me question my ties to Spanish. It made me question my career choice. It made me question so many things. And I felt so frustrated because I felt like I sacrificed so much, that I worked my way up from nothing, from being a Spanish monolingual, that I had pretty good knowledge. And I made it so far to teach in Europe in a summer. So after she said that, I was like, okay, whatever, right? And I walked away, and we were at a camp in the middle of nowhere, some mountains and cottages. So I went and hid behind some trees at night, and I just started to cry. Yeah. But at that time, I didn't know everything I know now about linguistics. I didn't know about the bilingual brain, and I didn't know about the advantages that I had, and I didn't know that actually I was quite competent, and I didn't know my own abilities. It wasn't until later on, a lot of conferences later, and publications, and finally seeing my PhD thesis and everything that I started to feel good. And even now that I'm publishing academically and I have people peer review my writing, and then it comes back to me with not that many corrections, I feel like that's even more evidence. And I think that just goes to show that no matter the linguistic discrimination that you may face as a second language learner, at whatever stage you are in your language learning, that there is always room to grow. There's always room to perfect your craft. There's always room to become a balanced bilingual. I could go back and be really good in Spanish, and I've been trying to do that as well. So don't let anybody say something stupid like that ever. Okay, think about it objectively. Anyway, so that's that. Let's continue. So the second legacy of colonialism was the loss of ethnic identity. So what is ethnic identity? I'll look up the word ethnicity for you, because a lot of people tend to confuse ethnicity with race. They're very interrelated. They're thorny subjects to talk about. Ethnicity is defined by, is this the OED? Oxford, as the fact or state of belonging to a social group that has a common national or cultural tradition. Okay, so it's a social construct based on your social group membership. So you could lose that sort of identity to your own culture, right? And this happened as a second outcome of colonialism. So indigenous people were denigrated to the extent that they felt like they had to abandon their own language. So it led to language loss. If they lose their language, they could lose a lot of aspects of their culture and tradition that revolve around language, oral traditions or practices. So leading up to the loss of ethnic identity. So a second legacy is that it led to either directly or indirectly the destruction of ethnic identities of many of whose lands were colonized. This in part is related to the loss of indigenous languages, as language and identity are heavily interrelated. You and I, everyone, has intimate ties to language. Language is not anything that is abstract, right? I mean, it is, they are symbols, but we attach values to those symbols of communication. And we grow up with language from the moment we're born. We interact with our close loved ones and our family members and our friends. We think about who we are. We put labels to describe the things out there in the world. We make sense of the world with language. Language is universal to you and me. Okay, so everybody has an intimate identity connection to language. So there are many examples of this identity connection. So for instance, we saw in the movie Talking Black in America, African-American Englishes and culture, right? And it was heavily intertwined, African-American English and their identity. It's a part of who they are. It's a way of living, it's a practice. Puerto Rico with Spanish, okay? So we see it in our national anthem. We see people fighting against the use of English in society, in your everyday life, a lot of people feel negative about the fact that if you go to Rincon, there are restaurants being run in English only. And English is seen by a lot as the language of the other, of Americans, of el gringo, right? So a lot of people feel outraged at these linguistic practices. Caucasian European Americans feel intimate ties to English. And this is seen in the whole English only ideology and how they discriminate against other people, multilingual and bilingual people who are just going about their everyday lives talking on the phone in Spanish to their family, right? And we've seen the online videos of Latinos being discriminated against. So it's crazy, but the fact of the matter is that people have ties with their language or with language. Language is closely tied to identity. They're related, right? And it has ideological outcomes. So out of the 175 indigenous languages still spoken in the United States, perhaps 20 are being transmitted to children. This is an estimate. It's not precise science. The situation, nevertheless, is not entirely hopeless. It is possible to revive indigenous languages or heritage languages as they are commonly known today. So there has been a lot of movement over the last decades to help indigenous communities, to help ethnic minorities maintain ties to their culture. Their culture meaning their language. So there are programs in the United States, in some schools, not all, to help students maintain these ties. There are heritage language programs in the United States that aim at, for instance, teaching Latinos Spanish, third generation Latinos that know nothing of Spanish, to teach them how to get back to it. There's also schools that have been set up by linguists and anthropologists to help indigenous communities educate their children so they can maintain dying or endangered languages. So they are aware of the importance of maintaining it, right? So there are small movements. And there are grants and scholarships provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities, also provided by the NSF, National Science Foundation, that give money, give aid to projects that revolve around documenting endangered languages. So you'll have linguists and linguistic anthropologists go into the field, do observations, interview people, and document language, and come up with a set of rules with their grammars, with their phonology, right? And you see, then you have the outcome. Finally, languages that were only oral once are then codified into material existence. And once they're codified into material existence, they could be distributed. They have a presence in our permanent material world. And then people can try and mimic these rules that are written, right? So we have this book that I actually own, Dine Bisad, Binaho, I don't even know if I said that right. It's been 10 years since I took Navajo. So you have books on indigenous languages right now. And you have applications, smartphone applications like Duolingo that have been adopting indigenous languages and have been putting platforms for people to learn indigenous languages. Like they have Navajo, for instance. And they also have indigenous languages in the UK. They have Scottish Gaelic, Irish, and Maori as well. So Maori has been experiencing a type of revival in the last decades as well, a linguistic revival. So it's been popularized a lot in the media by movies like Moana, and it's been tied to a sort of coolness ideology, right? And in the image portrayed next to the Wikipedia link is actually a girl that I went to school with, to university with, a PhD friend. Her name is Aoife Finn. So Aoife became sort of a social media influencer in that she was studying the Teoreo Maori. She was studying Maori language, and she was trying to document the syntax of Maori, right? But linguists, because they study a language, it doesn't necessarily mean that they know how to speak the language. But Aoife went to the trouble of doing a PhD in Maori syntax and also trying to learn Maori. So she would tweet every day about a Maori word or something that she was learning, and hashtag it and whatever. And she kind of incited a sort of movement. Okay, and then people started noticing her, like this random Irish scholar from elsewhere, right? And she's learning Maori, which is an indigenous community minority language, right? So there has been a lot of movement towards that, towards revitalization. So it's not the case that once it's endangered, it can be lost. But there needs to be a societal shift. And this societal shift starts first in the minds of people and in the ideologies that people have about indigenous languages. In the United States right now, a lot of indigenous communities are facing a type of identity crisis. And this is suggested by a title written by a Navajo elder, which is also showcased in our book. If a child learns only the non-Indian way of life, meaning the Anglo way of life, you have lost your child. So basically, there's no turning back. They will no longer remain in that Navajo culture life. So if it is the stories, songs, daily interactions in the native language that convey and transmit sense of place and sense of self, what happens when the language falls out of use? And you have to think that a lot of these indigenous languages have an oral history to them, right? Because they were oral languages before they were ever documented. And of course, when you're young, you're some of the things that social psychological research shows us is that when you're young, when you're an adolescent, your concern is fitting in. Your concern is being liked, right? And you're trying to figure out who you are in the world and your identity. So if the indigenous community and their culture and their language is looked down upon as something inferior or something to be ashamed of, your child or your teen will probably not want to pursue that path. So the distribution of indigenous languages in the United States is as follows. A lot of the remaining languages that still have a substantial portion of people that speak them are Navajo, Tohono O'odham, Havasupai, Hopi, and Hualapai. And I feel like there's probably a lot more, and a lot of the ones that she's mentioned are Western or indigenous languages, Southwest. There is a significant but declining amount of children speaking these indigenous languages. So it's on the decrease. The majority of the speakers are middle-aged or grandparent generations, meaning that, oh, they'll take their language with them, you know, and then it'll eventually die out. So we really need to stop that or put a pause to that language shift movement. Anyway, that's the end. Hope you enjoyed this lecture.